Because every screenwriter, I think this is really true, finishes a screenplay, thinks it's brilliant.
But people do it all the time, and they usually write mediocre scripts.
A lot of writers hate because they go like, but my script is different from theirs.
You have some characters sitting in a diner and somebody goes, ketchup, what's that about?
That is one way to put your audience to sleep very, very quickly.
The other thing is that what's real is boring.
I think a character with no inner life, I think, is boring.
And the story's going to be really boring and nobody's going to be interested.
And be bored to tears any time.
One thing Ray said to me was, he said, don't look outside yourself, look within. And so it's again finding, it's funny, there was one time when he and I were sitting together and I said, I just figured out what business you're in. I said, it's not writer. I said, you're in the Ray Bradbury business. And he said, yes, that's exactly right. And what he was doing was creating something that no one else could create. And he told me that he wrote every day for 10 years before he wrote a single line, a single word that was uniquely his. And then one day he sat down and he wrote the words "the lake." And he wrote a short story based on the time when he was a little boy. When he was 8 years old, he and a little girl friend who was 7 went swimming in Lake Michigan. And he came out and she never did. She drowned. And it was a story about her coming back as a ghost. And he told me that when he finished the story, tears were streaming down his face. And he knew he'd written something that no one else could have written. It came specifically from his experience and his soul. And he said it took another 2 years of writing every day before he could write something again that was uniquely his. And then he got to where he could do it again and again and again. And he became Ray Bradbury because he was determined to do that. And so I thought that was a great lesson to say, okay, what are you creating? What can you create that isn't something that's just an imitation of what others are doing, but that's unique to you, that no one else could have created, that you create something fresh in the world that's truthful and meaningful, and then you know you've done something worth doing. So that's been a great inspiration to me.
My underlying philosophy of all storytelling, whether you're a novelist or screenwriter, movie maker, TV writer, whatever it might be, is that your primary goal as a storyteller must be to elicit emotion. You must create an emotional experience for the audience, if it's a movie or a play, or for the reader, if you're a screenwriter and you have to get it read so you can get the movie made, or if you're a novelist or whatever. So your primary goal has to be to create emotion.
It's not that cliche, write what you know, because I've never written what I quote unquote know. I write fantastical worlds and supernatural stories and all of that. But write what you feel and write what's in your heart and write something that means something to you. And you know, I was a script reader for, God, probably a decade, and I was reading 7-8 scripts a week, and the rare one was the great script. And when you found that, that was a very exciting day at the office. And sometimes the really terrible scripts were they were fun because they were so god-awful. But the ones that got really exhausting and really enervating as a script reader who's sitting there and has to read a script, synopsize it, write a comment about it, then pick up another one and read it, and were the ones that you could tell were written by people who were looking at what last year's hit was and trying to imitate it. And those were deadly, and they weren't good, they weren't bad, they were safe and mediocre. And any writer, any young writer, any old writer, anyone who's just starting to write anything, write something that you feel, write something that comes from the heart. And people may not think that Beetlejuice is a personal movie. It's an intensely personal movie. It was intensely personal for Michael and me. And you know, I didn't know I had a theme until I had enough work to realize I had a theme. And almost everything I've written are about broken families who are put back together in some bizarre way. because I came from a broken family, I like to think that my work has a sense of heart and a sense of compassion and a sense of humanity in it, no matter how bizarre it is, no matter how weird the worlds get. And you got to write something that you feel and something that you have some passion for, or just why do it? It's too hard. It's just it's not an easy job, and I personally can't imagine saying, well, this was a hit. Now, so I'm gonna write my version of that. It's not really what I care about, what I feel, but I can imitate it well enough. I can't imagine spending a year of your life doing that, but people do it all the time. And they usually write mediocre scripts.
Not enough story. Again, it's that old thing. Characters can be wonderful, dialogue can be sparkling and even funny as heck. But if the story lays there just flat as a pancake, that story is not going anywhere. It's a weak story.
Well, I'm the slowest reader in the world. Like, it will take me 6 hours to read a script. I don't know why that is. I kind of read it out loud in my head or something. But what happens because of that is that I am stuck in every single moment in that script for a really long time, so I notice really quickly when something takes too long. Whereas a quicker reader would probably just go like, oh, here's a page of whatever, and I'll just continue reading on. I get angry if I'm on a page that doesn't know what it wants, and I don't know why I'm in that scene right now. And I hold the writer, this sounds very bad, but I kind of hold the writer personally responsible with wasting my time, which really isn't their fault because I'm just a slow reader. But at least after reading it, I have a very clear, and it might be completely off objectively, but I have a very clear idea where I felt the script worked or didn't work. And then I just apply. I'm a big believer in formula, is always a word, in classic narrative structure. Like from Aristotle over, I think Robert McKee is a genius. I know a lot of people think he's too formulaic and he's whatever. But I think that most of the weaknesses in a narrative, when it can't hold your attention, that is because it doesn't adhere to a certain narrative structure, if it be 3-act structure, a 5-act structure, whatever it is, that is ingrained in us as human beings, you know. So I work a lot with like question marks, for example, like at what moment, at this moment in the script, what are the question marks that I as an audience am burning to have answered, that make me turn the page? Why am I interested in continuing this? And a lot of time you'll realize there is no question mark, that people are just having coffee right now. And you know it's a problem, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is conflict and stakes, because drama is conflict and stakes. That also means that you don't know what the outcome of something will be. So there is a kind of internal magnetism and a structure from moment to moment that I think you have it's very easy to get a good feeling for that and to not be distracted by, that's maybe another thing. I'm not a very visual person, as in I don't see the script in my head, you know, at all. I feel the story, I read the story, get a feeling for the characters. I don't see images. And I think a lot of other people that do see the images are kind of seduced by that and don't necessarily see that the story is weak. You know, that the cornerstones of the story are not as powerful as they should be. But because I don't have that visual at all to distract me, I'm always after the moments that don't live up to their full potential in what they are trying to do. And that's a very abstract thing. It doesn't matter if that happens on a boat or in space or on a whatever. It's, you know, it's always the why should the audience be on the edge of their seat right now? What are they wondering about? What do they want to find out? Why do they care? What do they identify with? Those things, you know. So it's almost a mathematical structure, which helps me a lot because it is basically more or less the same starting point for almost every script, which of course a lot of writers hate because they go like, but my script is different from that script. It is different in subject matter and in content, but in the underlying audience expectation and the rhythm that an audience has in consuming a story, it's not different. It's met with the same expectations. So you have to see it through that lens to know how an audience is going to react to it, I think.
It's about creativity and originality too. I think originality comes from being curious, because the more curious you are about something, the more you know about something. And so the more you can avoid copying something, right? I think the people who write cliché, who have cliché writing, because they don't know what's been done before. So they go, to them it's new, and they go, oh, they think it's good. But people who know, and they've seen it 100 times because they're curious, will say it's cliché because they've seen it 100 times.
Hooking the reader is just so important regardless of what you're writing. I just think, you know, for me, if I'm not really feeling a book 50, and I don't put a lot of books down, but 50, 100 pages is a long time, and if I'm not feeling it, and you'd be surprised how many books I think don't really work on that level, I may not finish it. And especially when you're dealing with more commercial genres, it becomes even more important. Younger readers, I think it becomes even more important. That said, I don't think you need to rush or sacrifice the storytelling to make it so hooky. In a certain respect, like I personally wouldn't want to do that, but I think getting into the story right away, having something exciting happen in the beginning. In my book, I chose to write a prologue that showed kind of what happened before when the surface of the earth was destroyed. So I told it from, if you can imagine, the president's daughter's point of view as they're evacuating the White House. Oh, wow. So young girl being evacuated. And because I did that for a couple reasons, but one was I wanted to have something really exciting and really relatable that happened right off the bat, because I think that will hook you in and make you want to read more. But there's other ways to hook somebody, like having a great character. Having central mystery is something I teach about a lot, which is, it doesn't mean that it has to, obviously there's a mystery genre where the whole story is crafted around a mystery, but that said, you can have a story that has smaller mysteries that are revealed in the beginning of a book. A good example is in The Hunger Games. They talk about the reaping, which is the big thing that happens right away in The Hunger Games, but they say the word the reaping 7 or 8 times before they finally tell you what it is. And you find out fairly early in the story, but still you're kind of reading like, oh, what is this? What is this thing that's happening? What is this big event? So I think that's another way to kind of get somebody interested in trying to figure out what's going on.
And I got the script and I was really excited to read it. And the first page, I opened it up and it wasn't even formatted properly. And I read the first page and they weren't writing in proper sentences. And I had to slog through this thing to figure out what they were trying to say. And I gave up after a couple of pages because they'd abused me, basically. They'd stolen my time, they'd wasted my time on something that wasn't a professional product, that could never be produced in its current state. And maybe if I had forced myself to read the whole script, there would have been a nugget in there that was a great idea, and with some work, you know, I could have pounded the script into shape and tried to do something with it. But who has that time? And who knows? You could get to the end of this 120-page script. It takes you 2 hours out of a very busy day. And you get to the end and it could all have been crap. Even though that one-sentence pitch they sent me was a good idea. So you got to be sure. And you can't just read it yourself and think it's great. Other people have to be telling you it's great.
So you see this a lot. I mean, this is more about cliché writing. So you get like a character description where, you know, I read this all the time. You know, she's beautiful or handsome. You know, it's the same.
Tells me
same
nothing.
yeah. Right. I mean, you know, it's the same old that you've seen 100 times. You know, so you got to be a little more creative.
Passive central character. That has killed more scripts than just about anything I've ever seen. And weak story and passive central character, they go together. They really fit together too. A passive central character is a hero or heroine, you know, the lead down the middle, who doesn't really do anything. and life and the story happen to them. They do not happen to anything or anyone. And that is a one way to put your audience to sleep very, very quickly. Heroes have to be active.
Having an active hero who has a clear want is definitely a huge thing that I work with writers on. Every strong story starts with a trigger incident or inciting incident, as many people term it, that pushes the central character into a powerful dilemma. Then the choice that is made in the dilemma is what defines the external goal for the A story. And every obstacle, escalating obstacle, and all is lost moment need to link back to that choice. And when the goal isn't clear, the story doesn't work. Because everything needs to link back to, like there are countless features as well as TV shows where in the middle of the story, you have no idea what the central character wants. Like you've lost it because the actions and obstacles aren't linked to the desire. And we lose a sense of what the desire was. So when you do that, story doesn't work. And very often, writers will write a passive hero that isn't taking action.
I think a character with no inner life, I think, is boring. You know, I think if for me, I think if the character is having some inner life, if that makes sense, you know, whether that inner life is subtext or whether that inner life is in conflict with his public life or her public life, you know, that's interesting to me. You know, I don't know. I think it really depends on the kind of story it is, and you know, I guess, you know, to use a comparison to like making a meal, I think every meal is different. You know, every meal demands different kind of ingredient. If there's something about that character that tells me that either that person isn't telling everything about his life or her life, or there's something about that person that what he or she is doing, you know, in front of people is different from what they're doing behind the scenes. For me, that's interesting.
Every scene is a power grab. Everybody wants to take control of the situation in whatever way that means to them. And so how are they sort of secretly jockeying for position, you know, like he and I do? Like which of us, we're all just worried, we're worried about which of us looks smarter. See, that's what this whole interview has been. The other thing that you said about the desires on the part of the character. I was thinking, I know you said there's a lot more than two, but two more I would think about as the writer, besides, what were the two you said? What does the character
The two different objectives.
Yeah.
Basically what I broke down, Michael, is what I call the public objective.
Right.
In other words, if I asked, in fact, anybody in this room now, what are you doing here? What do you want? What's your objective right now? And we could talk about, we're doing this interview. That's our public objective. Then there's underneath that, deep underneath, is a private objective, which may not even be recognized.
Well, that's what I was...
It may be in the unconscious. What's driving that character to try to do that?
Right. And one way I would look at it, is not quite the same as a desire, is to ask, what is the character hiding from the other person consciously? What is she hiding from him, and what is she hiding from herself? What's the thing that she's not yet aware of that is really driving her, and you know, underneath, especially in the first half or 3/4 of the movie. Towards the end, you'd hope that all that would come to the surface. But deception and secrecy are very, very powerful in telling a story. because they add a whole new layer of conflict. They get into this inner journey stuff, and the more conflict on the more layers, the more you're going to pull in your audience.
That's good. I like the hiding thing. See, because I was into that, the subconscious or the unconscious or the unaware of, but the hiding and deception and secrecy. That's good. I'm going to steal that. Can I steal that?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
It's yours.
Thank you. No, you can still use it. I mean, I'm not taking it forever.
Oh, okay. You want to share it. You don't want to steal it.
No, I'm not going to stay. Yeah, I'm not going to.
As long as we're clear that my agenda is to look better.
I'll give you credit for it.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Because we know my stated objective is to look smarter. I think we.
Yes, and I'm trying to help you with that.
I appreciate that.
Or help you think you're winning.
Thank you. Let's move on. That was great. Let's move on.
Did you know, for instance, that there are only 4 viable goals in all of narrative screenwriting?
And those
4.
goals are, yeah?
Win, stop, escape, or retrieve. So, okay, you've got an idea for a character, your hero or heroine. Great, you've got an idea. And they have, okay, now what is it they want? Well, they've got to have a goal to pursue, right? Well, it has to fall into the category of win, stop, escape, or retrieve. Now, these are big categories, and there are many versions of each one, many permutations of each one. So it's not like it's that cut and dried, but it will appear to a lot of people like that's too cut and dried for me. But the point is this: there's only those 4 because those 4 share something in common. They all provide a visible, physical, 3-dimensional goal for a motion picture that will result in a physical climax and obligatory scene. It precludes the use of internal goals, and that's one of the things people have to get over. An internal goal, that's great, and it is separate from what drives the movie. You need a physical, visible goal. Each one of those 4 goals has a finish line, a visible finish line. And a goal like, well, they want to feel better about themselves. That doesn't work on film. It just doesn't work.
Personally, I like to try to get to know the character in my own mind, know the characters enough in my own mind so that I know how they're going to behave or react to whatever I throw at them. To me, it's like if you can understand the characters, and sometimes that's why it's so easy, or excuse me, sometimes that's why it's better to base a character on somebody you know or yourself, because, you know, whether you base it on your brother or your mother or your best friend or yourself, because then you know how that person talks, how that person's going to react to something, and then you don't have to make everything up. Otherwise, the burden of you as a writer to make up everything that happens is a lot. Whereas if you know who the character is, and the example I always use is if somebody's walking down the street and a guy jumps out with a knife and says, "Give me your wallet," if it's me as a character, I'd probably get on my hands and knees and start crying and, you know, whatever. If it's Jason Bourne, you know, a chase ensues, you know what I mean? So knowing the character first, I think, is helpful. And then, yeah, I think all writers probably have in their mind a handful of, if not everything, a handful of things that are supposed to happen that are going to drive the story. But I prefer, probably to my detriment, to only think out the whole thing to a certain degree. I try not to have everything set, and I try to, maybe I have certainly maybe the first act. I know what the inciting things are going to be, but then I like to sort of let the characters in some way tell me what the next scene is, as opposed to making them do something that I've already. I think more interesting things have come out of that. And in the times where I've had, like a lot of us have an ending in our mind, the times where I've had a definite ending, like the whole reason for writing the script was because I got the last scene in my head. Mm. By the time I get there, inevitably it's not that, because the characters have grown and the situation has taken on some sort of life of its own. So by the time it gets to that thing, it doesn't make sense anymore. That would have been an imposed ending or an artificial ending. And so I think the writing can be a lot easier the more real those characters become for you.
All of these characters, there's only 14 that that help you create a plot, that help move a story forward. And any other character that a particular writer wants to plot, you know, I really like this character. You know, they're kind of interesting and peppy and zippy and they talk funny and I like it. If they do not serve the story, if they do not help drive the plot forward, get rid of them, axe them, cut them, lose them, because they have to serve a function.
What's the heart and soul of this? It's a really interesting screenplay. It's a thriller, action, adventure thriller. But what is at the soul of it that the audience can grab onto and identify with? My feeling is the audience doesn't really want to watch a big action adventure film. What they want, I mean, they'll watch it, they'll be thrilled to watch it, one that's well done, but they want to connect with the people and what the people's journey is and what the people's struggles are and what the people's epiphanies are or disappointments are and the transformation of characters. That's what they want to. They want to connect with the aspect of that story that relates to their own lives, which may be very subtle or may be very, very powerful, but we have to identify that. So talking with these two writers yesterday, that was the goal, is to find that. And then once we can identify that with the writers, then we can, all of us can ask each other, is it in the script? Is it clear in the script that that's what it is? But first of all, you got to figure out what it is. And that's why many times looking at a script, you can feel it's not there. But rather than trying to cover it up or pretend it's there or assume that it's there or just insert something there, go back to the writers. Go back to the people who had the original idea and find out what that is and then try to identify that. And that is actually, for a director, that's what's going to guide you through the entire rest of the process. That's what the movie is all about. This movie is all about this character who is fighting these struggles, who is fighting these aspects of himself and the world around him and his family or his work or whatever he's fighting. And that what gets revealed through that process is what this man or this woman is going through that we can identify with it. So you got to get that early. Then the process of the rewrites or re-examining the script is, how can we get that in? How can we make that clear to the audience? Also clear to the actors, really important. So the actors can see it, the actors who are playing these parts can attach themselves to that.
A skin jump is where we, as the audience, jump onto the screen and become the protagonist in the story. And a good story has some sort of a fantasy, and it doesn't have to be a positive fantasy, that we want to explore in our life. So we skin jump and we are Elliot riding his bicycle with E.T. and it flies. You know, and that is like one of those moments where if you were to turn the camera on the audience and watch the audience, they would all be just overjoyed because we're all Elliot in that scene for that moment. And if we're looking at a movie that's we can become Indiana Jones and do the amazing adventure thing. And we basically jump from the audience onto the screen, which means we need a character to jump into. And a good story is about a character that fulfills some sort of dream fulfillment, some sort of fantasy the audience has. And the reason why a film is a hit is because it ends up hitting the dream fulfillment elements of a lot of people. And so if you can figure out the zeitgeist of what the audience, what people are dreaming about right now, that's that thing that's going to pull us onto the screen. But it doesn't have to be a positive thing. Often, I did a film noir class here, and the film noir often jumps us into people that do bad things. Because we all sometimes secretly want to do bad things, but we can't. So, you know, we all want to, you know, there's a lot of movies about career criminals because we all sometimes want to break the law. There are a lot of movies about people that do terrible, awful things that kill people, horrible bosses that kill their bosses or try to do bad things because we have that thing going on inside of us. That's the dream fulfillment of that story. So a good movie is dream fulfillment to the audience. The audience fantasizes about something. We, hopefully as part of that audience, as members of that audience, we fantasize about some of those things too. A weird movie is when somebody has their dream fulfillment and you go, what kind of a sick weirdo is that dream? And you see those sometimes and go, what's going on here? But a good story is going to allow the audience to jump into that character and then take that character on an adventure. It could be a good adventure, it could be a bad adventure, but we're going to go along with that story. And so that means there's going to be a great conflict in there someplace. That means often, the thing that often happens is romance of some sort of another, because even if it's, E.T. is a boy and his dog story, but the dog's an alien. And there is no more unconditional love than from your dog, or I don't know, your cat loves you, but your dog loves you no matter what. So that's something we can fantasize about. We can get into that story, we can understand that story, and jump into Elliot's life with E.T. And it's the guy that brings the kid that brings home the pet that mom doesn't want and has to hide it in the closet, and all those things. I found a stray dog, but the stray dog's an alien. And now the dog catcher wants him. The dog catcher's keys. He's the guy from the government. So it's taking that story and finding a new take on that story, because that could have been just a dog story, but by making it the alien, we're now telling the story we've already heard. We're telling a story that's new, that's different, that gives us a different experience than we've had before.
The hero is the audience. You build a story so that the hero is, with lots of flaws and everything, fine, yes, make them human, but they have certain qualities, character, of character and of circumstance. They have to be brave. That is absolutely essential. But you can put them in, unfair injury. We care about people who are being unjustly dealt with. They're in a situation of danger. They're funny, they have a sense of humor, that always helps, loved by other people. There is this kind of list of things you can do to keep characters interesting. That allows us to like them, and once we start seeing the nature of the hero or heroine's major problem and the major impossible task before them, hopefully on about page 6 or 8, we, the audience becomes one person, each of us sitting alone, and we project ourselves, psychologically project ourselves into the hero, and then we're along for the ride. And if that hero doesn't do anything or doesn't want anything, and other people do all this stuff, and all the people that come in, all the secondary characters are the witty, fun, urbane, loquacious, and they're and joking and funny. They're all the funny characters, while basically your central character is more or less wallpaper. It's dead.
There are many things that story is not, and it also relates back to this idea that story is better than the real. So one of the things that story is not is that it is not a literal day in the life. It is not just a plod through the day, and I get my coffee and I wake up in the morning and I go to work. There's something that there is a core action or a core problem that is bigger or better than the real, that ties it in, that can tie it into an everyday situation, but it's not just those little everyday moments. And I just wanted to throw in there, Boyhood was my favorite movie of the year, and I think that it breaks all of these rules. But the reason why it works is that it's not just a day in the life or recounting, but it's also this device of having happened over 12 years that makes it so fascinating. And so there are exceptions to this rule, but on the whole, these are the things that people should avoid when they're approaching their stories.
Another one is random musings. This is it seems to me where it's very pretentious, where you have some characters sitting in a diner and somebody goes, "Ketchup, what's that about?" Right? And then the movie just kind of moves through people saying that. And it's funny to point out that people think they're profound when they're not once in a while. But if your whole movie is just kind of like, "Ketchup, what's that about?" The audience, after about 20 minutes, if that long, will go, do I need to be here for this? What is this? And it feels very pretentious, kind of just fishing around. Well, these are just some people who really, they had one germ of an idea, but they really didn't think this through. It doesn't have any progression.
Mm-hmm. Stories also, it's not a straight line. It needs to go up and down and around, and there needs to be highs and lows. And in the same way that it's not a day in the life, it's not just a straightforward telling of events.
You know, another one is story is not a fascinating place or even a really cool event. So we get pitches like this all the time. People are like, I'm going to write a story about, or I have a movie about a nuclear submarine getting stuck on the bottom of the ocean. And we go, and what's the story? What's the story? And they're like, a nuclear submarine's on the bottom of the ocean. It's like, that's not a story. A story is when you start telling me and what the character stakes are, you know, with that, you know. So another one is, oh, wow, I went to this amazing village in China. And, you know, it's the village where they make, you know, the dragons for the festivals. It's amazing. And my movie is like that village. It's like, that's not a story. That's an arena. So we're constantly having to help writers distinguish a really cool arena, you know, or an interesting, you know, kind of event from being a story. Those things aren't stories.
Yeah, or Chicago in the 20s. Yeah. You know, again, great arena, but you have nothing until you have your characters doing something that's going to move your story forward.
We have a structural tool called the BMOC, which is beginning, middle, obstacle, and climax. These are the 4 points in any great story where the hero's asked to change. And they're in every great story, whether it's Star Wars or The Fault in Our Stars or Fast and Furious, Tokyo Drift. And these 4 points also work inside every scene. They're in every action sequence, this BMOC. So this rhythm of story is present in all great stories. If you don't have good news, bad news, raising stakes, and ticking clocks on every page of your story's going to be boring. But hardly anyone teaches that. And being conscious of how those tools work is how you start putting them on every page. And by the way, these suspense tools work in drama, they work in romantic comedy, they work in every genre, and they work in television too. If you go and look at a Tarantino script, or you go and look at a Chris Nolan script, or you go and look at a Lynn script, you will see on every page, once you've been shown it, that every page has ticking clocks, every page has good news, bad news, every page has raising stakes. A lot of them have other suspense tools too, but writers are often unaware of this consciously. They don't build this into their stories when they write them. So just being aware that this is how, and they're cheap tricks, by the way. It's good news. I'm giving you $20. Bad news, I'm slapping you. Ticking clocks is just a bomb ticking down. It's a gun pointed at someone. These are not sophisticated tricks. They're simple. But the greatest artists use them in all of their best work. You've never seen a Tarantino script that didn't have 3 or 4 pointed guns in nearly every scene. It's cheap, and it works like a charm. It entertains. And that's why we also see these in television. Breaking Bad is nothing but a series of excruciating suspense devices. So excruciating, I couldn't even get Ceci to watch it. And when you sit down to watch Breaking Bad, you often have to stop because it's so repellently tension-making. But that's what makes it great.
In the very beginning, seriously, coming up with a good idea is the most important thing. And I was coming up with sort of basic genre ideas. So I would write like a basic cop story, and that's fine for television, not fine for cinema, where it's all about the event. It's all about something being big and larger than life. So my ideas were like too small to begin with. And that I have a string of scripts with like, they're got great scenes, great characters, but the idea is way too small. It's not involving and interesting enough for people to spend $12 to see the movie. On top of that, whatever it costs for the king-size popcorn and the king-size drink, you know, it's a life's fortune to go to the cinema these days. When I'm trying to come up with an idea or write a script, it's, would this be a movie that I would be in the audience for? And it's interesting that I know people that write scripts that they would not go see that movie it was made. And I'm like, why would you write that then if you're not even the audience for the movie? So I try to write a movie that's not the movie that not what I would want to see, because really what I want to see is the producer of my last film spanked in public. I write a movie that is the kind of movie that I would want to see, that I would stand in line to see, that is, an existing kind of movie that I'm sitting in the audience for.
They just don't bother to go deeper. You know what I mean? You got to be original. I mean, that's another thing. Originality is very important. Because if you read the same thing over and over, you're just gonna you're not gonna respond to it. So really, that is actually the bane of the writer's existence, especially the screenwriter, to come up with something new. I mean, when you think about, I think in the second edition of the 101 Habits, Bill Marsili, one of the screenwriters there, talks about doing the 20s. So for him, like everything that he thinks about, any event, any scene, character, whatever, he thinks of kind of listing 20 different ways of doing it. Like if it's like talk about the meet cute, right, in a romantic comedy, how people meet in a cute way. Well, he's going to do 20 different thoughts about it. Okay, they can mean this, they can do this. I mean, you have to do, he does 20, because the first 2 or 3 or 5 of them will be cliches. Will be things that you're automatically going to think about them because they're the most famous ones. They're the most that we've seen 100 times. But by going deeper, and he forces himself to go deeper, that's where you get the creativity and the originality. And eventually, when you reach that past the 10 or 12, 15, all the way up to 20, you'll start getting some really original ways because you forced yourself. And so that's what the writer needs to do. You got to force yourself to go deeper in order to create some original writing. Try it as a game. It's a tip that he uses as a like habit of creativity, to just do the 20 for anything. 20 different ways to rob a bank, 20 different ways to say I love you, 20 different ways to break up with someone, 20 different ways to kill someone. I mean, there's all these things that you've seen 100 times, and when you see it over and over, you go, you go, huh, because you've seen it 100 times. And it's only the movies that break out, the stories that break out are the ones that are kind of truly original, right? Whenever you come up with a unique angle to that story that we all know, the better for you. That's where originality comes in, so. And it gets harder and harder because, the more romantic comedies there is, the harder it is to come up with something new. So,
My first step in writing a screenplay is coming up with 100 ideas and picking the best idea. I have a thing called the 100 idea theory. It doesn't have to be 100 ideas, but if I come up with one idea, that's one idea, and it could be a terrible idea. If I come up with 100 ideas or 60 ideas or whatever, I can comb through and find the very best idea, and then I take it to Thunderdome. I take that idea and I go, if I write the script of this, everyone's going to pick it apart. So I want to pick it apart first. I want to find all the flaws with whatever the idea is, and try to get past those flaws and remove them so that the idea is great.
The naturalism is not naturalism. And I'm talking about, for example, dialogue that has a lot of vocalized pauses, ers and ums and you knows and I mean and so on.
We love that line, story's better than the real, because one of the things that we've figured out is, story is a thing that's different than real life. And I mean, you could talk about that for 10 years. What does that mean, especially in the in the realistic filmmaking, the phase that we're seeing, especially in the indies. But the truth is that a story isn't real life, and in some ways, something's a story in every way in which it's not real life, right? So, in real life, people are mainly mysterious to us. We don't know why they do what they do. We don't have access to their motivations. Story is not like that. We do have access to their motivations. We do know what's driving them. So watching a story, you get a little surge of guilty pleasure because it gives you something real life cannot legitimately give you and that you have no right to want in real life. So if a movie when we read a script, if it doesn't give that access, if it doesn't clarify the motives of a character really, what they want and what they need and what's driving them, it's a bad story, because that's one of the things that people expect in story, that they're going for, is access, emotional access.
The problem with real, there are two problems with it. First of all, it's available in the streets for free. You don't have to buy a ticket and go into the movie theater, hire a babysitter, drive to the theater, park the car, pay for the ticket to see what's real. You can just step out into the street and see what's real. The other thing is that what's real is boring for the most part. I could tell you about my day today. Everything that I could tell you would be true and contemporary, really, really new. What I had for breakfast, the route that I took to get over to the campus, the context of 3 meetings. This is a big meeting day, the first Wednesday in the month. So I've been to 3 meetings today. I love my colleagues, and I thank God every day that God placed me in a place like this at UCLA where creativity is happening, and I'm allowed to do creative work. But these were not terribly exciting meetings. I could walk you through the agendas of those meetings, and you'd be fast asleep. It's even though it's true, and it's now. Again, we want boredom in our lives, and we want passion and excitement in our art.
And another way that story is better than the real is that the settings are more interesting than our everyday lives. We don't go to the movies to watch somebody, in the bathroom for an hour getting ready for work. That's our everyday mundane life. We go to the movies to see beautiful landscapes and beautiful vistas, and to see quirky worlds and quirky arenas that are more interesting than our everyday world. And similarly, the characters in movies, we like them because there is something just a little bit, they're like us, but they're just a little bit better than us. And that's the quality of a hero, is somebody who aspires to do the things that we could grow up to do, that are within reach of what we could do, but are just, they're just going a little bit more beyond what we might be doing in everyday life.
Yeah. Another way stories are better than the real is that they're structured around a theme. They're structured around some universal truth about human life. And this is not your real life, right? Your real life, if I say to you, how did you learn, what's some big lesson you learned? And you say to me, well, I learned that it's important to be truthful. I learned this, by the time I was 30, that I wasn't gonna lie anymore. And it's like, okay, so that means you probably had 1,000 little incidents from the time you were 4 and started talking, where you started to learn, when I lie, I get in trouble, and having to juggle storytelling and, and all of this stuff. And so finally at the age of 30, you go, boing, I'm not gonna lie anymore, right? But it's this cumulative thing that, well, in a movie or in a story, this happens in 2 hours, where you take out all the other lessons that people are learning, and you say, we're just gonna look at how Luke learned that he needs to trust the Force, right? In Star Wars. We're not going to look at all Luke's other problems, that he's a slob, or he has issues with women, or that he's got jealousy stuff. No, we're just going to hone in on that. So it's a very unnatural, structured around a theme experience. So when we read a screenplay, that it just seems to be all over the place, we say to people, this isn't going to work as a story, because the audience doesn't get, what are we talking about here? What is this about? And that's one of the big notes that we end up giving all the time, that the writer hasn't been able to really say, this story is about this, and so I'm going to eliminate everything that isn't about that, the big idea. That writers sometimes just never made that choice. And so you stand back from the screenplay and you say, I don't know what this comes down to in the end. I don't know what this is really about. So a story is better than real life, because it gives us, it really cuts out everything that isn't on your main universal truth.
And story also has a resolution, unlike real life, where it seems like we're always waiting for our Act 3 to happen. We often don't know what resolutions are going to be happening for us in our everyday world. But in a story, it needs to resolve, and that resolution needs to be satisfying. And it's the satisfaction that comes from that resolution that makes that story better than what we normally go through in life.
And then on top of that, all the little elements of story are better than real life. So dialogue, you know, to write a good line of dialogue, sometimes it'll take me 3 weeks, and then 10 drafts later, I'm still tweaking that comeback. Think about it as you have a fight with your friend, and then you sit there in the shower kind of replaying that, and you keep coming up with
I should have said
I should have
this.
said that line. Like, that's what movies are. The writer has gotten that perfect response. So you have this perfect back and forth repartee that real life never has. If people in real life talk the way they do in the movies, these would be crazy people. You know, but in the movies, it's okay, it's expected, you know, in storytelling. So the idea of everything being honed to be entertaining, to be compelling, to be a feast. A story is a feast as opposed to just running through the refrigerator, open the door, and grab a few things. That's real life, right? But a story is a feast. And so so we say to our writers, you know, what you've done here just isn't feasting enough. It's just not better enough than people's real life. And you know, we always quote this one line: when the cinema verite movement was going through the 50s, everybody was trying to do realism, mainly coming out of Europe because they didn't have any money. But Hitchcock, the great master, said, you know, some people want movies to be a slice of life. You know, I want movies to be a slice of cake. You know, and there it is. Yeah. You know, that a movie is better than the real in that it's a slice of cake. And if it's, we don't see it on the screen, on the paper, because you're trying too much to be gritty and real, then it's like, why would anybody want to do this? And the last thing I would say too is that your movie needs to be at least as good as the real, but it needs to be better than the real. So in other words, it can't be such that people watch this movie and go, wow, people don't talk like that. That would never happen.
Or this is so boring.
This is like, yeah, right, you know. So those are signs that the script isn't working, that your movie isn't even as good as the real. So you got to attend, you got to get to the real, and then you got to push it and be better than the real.
Everybody thinks they're the hero of their own story, and there's a little truth to it. But I gotta say, I mean, if I'm talking from experience and from hearing people's life stories that they want to write as movies, I would say about 90% of them are not that interesting. They just, the writers themselves think it's interesting. I don't think it is interesting, and audiences don't think it's interesting. So they gotta learn that. That's why feedback comes in. If the feedback is like, okay, well, you know, I mean, I always bring out Hitchcock's quote about, you know, drama is real life with all the boring parts cut out. So a lot of people feel that just because they've had a few interesting experiences, maybe unique, that it warrants them to making a movie out of it. They may be right, but a lot of times they're not.
And that there are only 4 emotions. Mad, sad, glad, and scared. You haven't heard that one?
No.
Again, there are, they are, you know, there's a lot of variations between mad, sad, glad, and scared. There's many permutations and dimensions there. But the way they are useful is like this. If you are building, if you're outlining something, a section, a particular section, hero goal sequence, or a particular scene, the thing is, the way you guarantee that it's going to have conflict and change in it, and change is one of the single most important, we could talk about that in a minute too. Change is the power that makes screenplays either work or not work. You got to quantify it, but it can be done wonderfully. That if the hero, lead character, walks, stomps, jumps, falls into a scene, and they are either mad, sad, glad, or scared, by the end of the scene, they have to be one of the others. If they're mad when they show up, they have to be scared when they walk away. Or if they're scared when they show up, they have to be glad when they walk away, because that guarantees dramatic change within the scene. And it's a way of checking yourself, because we read a whole lot of scenes which are just talk. And they're the same, everything is the same at the end as it was at the beginning, and that is not a viable scene for visual storytelling.
The thing you should be aware of is human dynamics. psychology, emotions, character relationships, that you should be well versed in. Now, lucky is the writer who has had an amazing life experience and had all those experiences that he can write about. That makes it easier. But it's not necessary. If you're a highly curious person, I mean, you could be a great writer who's had a very mediocre life. I mean, I'm not a believer of the Hemingway thing about, if you want to write about adventure, you gotta go and be adventurous and stuff. I mean, maybe there's some truth to it, but I think it really depends on your mind and your curiosity, and I think we can all find, it's all about your imagination. If you're highly imaginative, you can write about anything, whether you experience it or not. I mean, if you write science fiction, George Lucas didn't experience going on a ship in order to be able to write about it, right? Or James Cameron, do you think all the stuff about Pandora and Avatar, that he experienced that in his own life? No, it's all imagination, right? So that's what you need. You need to know, you need to have high imagination, obviously, but then you need to be well versed in character relationships. So yes, if you've had experience with character relationships, that's great, and character conflicts. But if you haven't, you can always learn it. And if you're highly curious, I mean, I have a psychology degree, so if I wasn't a writer, I'd be a psychologist, because that's what fascinates me. I'm fascinated by human interactions, human psychology, and especially the reason why people do what they do, which is what characters do in stories. So really, that works for me. But my life story, as much as I consider it very unique and different from most people's life stories, I don't have a desire to write about it. So it doesn't affect me at all in that sense.
I think the thing, and that's a thing that screenwriters have to do, is screenwriters have to figure out how to get out there in the world, how to get out of their, for many reasons, they have to figure out how to get out of their home and out of their comfort zone. Because one of the things that happens is, as we shrink our world, we shrink what we can write about. And we end up writing stories, as my 2 years in my apartment after selling the script were just like smaller and smaller and smaller stories, because I was not getting out in the world and being part of the world. And it's one of those things where life experience is the raw material for your scripts. And the more life experience you have, whatever that is, broken hearts, all that stuff is all part of what makes you who you are, so you write the script. But also, if you don't see the world out there, people, often online now, people will ask questions, research questions, and they go, well, how do I know about this? And my answer to that is, you find the person that does that for a living and you ask them. You don't ask me, I'm a writer, what the hell do I know? But if you want to know about stuff, you go out and ask those people, because part of that is you get out of your comfort zone and into the world, but you also get the real answers. And so I did a script called Recall that was about the auto industry, and I went to, when it existed, the Van Nuys GM plant, and across the street was a bar, and I went into that bar and I bought pitchers of beer. And I asked guys that worked on the assembly line just to tell me about their lives. And I got all kinds of just stuff that I could never get from Google, never get from, going to the library. It was all stuff that was their real life. And one of the things that made it into my script was this guy that talked about how his hands were so calloused that he was afraid to touch his wife. And it was a real heartbreaking story. And it's like one of those things that you don't think about. When you think about guys working on an assembly line, you don't think that there's going to be this thing that's going to affect their romantic, emotional life. And those were the stories, the great stories.
By conflict, you don't have to have an antagonist for conflict. I mean, most characters in comedy are in conflict anyway. They're in conflict because they're assholes, and so they're in conflict with their coworkers, or they're idiots, and so they're in conflict with the world around them, or they're like George in Seinfeld, always kind of downtrodden, Eeyore, as it were, and so he's in conflict with the world, and so the best comedies create characters that are intentionally conflicting with either other people or the world or themselves. What you don't need is, you don't need an antagonist. You can have an antagonist, but it's not necessary. In Groundhog Day, there's no antagonist. There's no villain who's trying to thwart him. It's just that he's a jerk who, you know, everybody kind of rolls their eyes about. And then he's stuck in this time warp that, how did it happen? No one knows. How do I get out of it? No one can help him. So that's the conflict. So the premise actually introduces the conflict, the catalyst. And you usually want to create that conflict in the protagonist after you have successfully sketched out the normal world. Don't start, you know, it's not an action film. Don't start, or you could. I mean, there's no rule that can't be broken. But, you know, don't start with something crazy happening before I know who this person is. What's their normal world? What's the deal with them? What's the deal with how they live? And then you can create something that threatens that normal world. Again, in Big, there's a whole scene of him, his relationship with his best friend, his wanting to be with the little girl, and then the conflict is, but now he's a 30-year-old man. What does he want to? What does he do? In Groundhog Day, it's living the same day over and over again. In Splash, it's you fall in love with a mermaid. But before that, you want to take the time to let me know, what would this guy be like? What would the world be like if that didn't happen? Take the, you know, and is that 2 pages, 5 pages, 10 pages? It's got to be what you need to create the foundation of a real world before the crazy world starts. Again, because the better your foundation, the better we're going to believe the incredibly crazy things that are happening in Act 3.
What they teach you in film school or any writing book is, you know, conflict is the source of all drama. That if everybody, if all your characters are just getting along, then
it's boring.
Yeah, nothing. You know, how long are you going to? So I mean, I think there's a tendency. There's a reason why most movies over the last 20 years have adopted the James Bond opening, which is just start with conflict from frame one, so that you can hold everybody's attention. That's a good question. I would probably say that, you know, delaying conflict too long, or not introducing what the central conflict is going to be, can be a problem. Like, for example, I did a short recently. It was like a 40-minute short. And shorts are harder because I think, you know, because you have less time to establish character. And the movie that I was making is this thriller called Where's Roman, which I'm actually very, very happy with. It's kind of a surrealistic thriller. And the 3/4 of the movie is really this one character venturing into this very disturbingly weird hotel and meeting all these characters and all these terrible things happening to him. But I wanted you to care about this character before all this crazy shit happened. So I deliberately wrote a, you know, like almost a 5 or 6 minute scene in a bar where you meet this main character through another character. And it virtually is no conflict. It's really just two guys who, like a strangers meeting, just having a conversation about stuff. And it was a way of getting you to know who this guy was and what his situation was and who he was before all this stuff happened. And I think half the audience, or the people that watched it, half or a little more than half, really appreciated that. And then I met another filmmaker, you know, who's been around for years and years and years, and said, I really loved the movie. I would have cut down that conversation at the beginning. Meaning that he was saying, you know, get to the thing, get to the conflict soon. I think that's the hardest thing for writers to do, is to try to establish a character even through action, and at the same time getting the plot going, which tends to be when the conflict is established. So the only danger of starting with conflict too soon is that you've got to somehow maintain this level of drama, and that if you stop, that people are going to be accustomed to a certain tension or a certain thing, and when you stop to smell the roses, you may lose everybody. But, you know, I don't know. That's what I was thinking.
One of the key skill sets, in addition to creative integration, is to be able to write in compelling conflict. And compelling conflict is what takes great characters and great dialogue and just makes it pop off the page. It's hard to explain, but you have a visceral experience when you read. You read some stuff, it's just bad. And then you read some stuff and it's got some great moments and some great characters or dialogue, but it's nothing really happening. Then you read some stuff and it's good, things are happening and it's interesting. But then you read something and it just pops off the page. You can tell. I was a studio reader and I could tell within one page if someone knew what they were doing, if it popped off the page or not. Now, if that one page was great, I don't know if they could write a whole script. I have to keep reading. But if that one page didn't pop, I knew they couldn't. And yeah, if I had a class of about 20 people, there'd usually be about 2 people and their writing just sort of popped off the page more than others. They didn't know why necessarily, but everyone could tell, and I think they could tell. They would often not say anything. It's like in a writing group, there's usually one person whose writing just is better than everyone else's, or in an MFA program. It just, maybe people don't know why, but it does. What I've learned is it's because they're writing in compelling conflict. And I find that about 5% of the writers that come to work with me naturally do that. I don't have to teach them. It just has that popping off the page. And about 5% sort of do that. And the other 90% are anywhere from they need some work to they suck at it. They just suck at it. But you can teach people how to do it. So a great example is Neil Simon, the playwright. He has a book called Rewrites, which is his autobiography. And he talks about, like, year after year when he was a younger man, he'd write these plays and he loved the characters and everyone thought they were hysterically funny, but there was just something missing. It just didn't hold together. It just wasn't interesting enough. And over time, he's like, I know something's missing, but I don't know what it is. And I know a lot of writers who feel that way, and it's a really terrible feeling. He eventually did the one thing he never wanted to do, is he went to his older brother, who was a really successful writer. And his older brother read his stuff and said, you're not writing in compelling conflict. And Neil Simon's like, what are you talking about? What is this? And he said, my older brother taught me what it was. And then the light bulb went off. And so then he said, I would just structure my compelling conflicts and then pour in all the character and comedy. And that's how he did his career. David Mamet, and this is on my website or you can look online, he did a memo about a decade ago or so to the writers of The Unit, his TV show. And he basically said, you will learn how to write in compelling conflict or you'll be in the blanking unemployment line or the bread line. And there was a lot of F-bombs in this memo, but he was basically saying, this is not a natural skill set for most people. You will learn to do this or you will not survive.
Any story, you can talk about an epic poem, you can talk about a myth, you can talk about a fairy tale or children's book. They're all built on character, desire, and conflict. Every story that I can think of, almost without exception, if it's a narrative story that has a beginning, middle, and end, is going to be about a character who desperately wants something and something stands in their way.
Too little conflict in any story or too little tension and the story's going to be really boring and nobody's going to be interested. I think you need to have conflict and tension almost, if not in every scene of your book, pretty much in every scene. Even scenes that are character driven, I always think you want to look for how can you ramp up the tension in that, even if it's just a dialogue exchange. You try to have moments that are ratcheting up the tension. So a good example of that is something like in the beginning of The Shining, the movie. I also love the book, but the film, there's a scene where it's the mom talking to Child Protective Services. So you're learning information about the fact that the father may have been abusive towards the son, but it's just a dialogue scene. But the whole time she's smoking a cigarette and the ash just gets longer and longer. And you're like, oh my God, Ash, your cigarette. You get so tense for her. You're like, that's gonna fall all over you. And she doesn't. And it just somehow is this genius way of just keeping tension. So there's always little things you can look at in a scene to kind of keep the tension going. And then obviously there's big conflict scenes where there's a fight or actually something major happening or a major obstacle. But I think throughout a story, that's what keeps you reading. And people even be like, oh, it's getting worse. It's getting so much worse for these characters. And, you know, or even like a book series like Game of Thrones, you're like, oh my God, things are still happening and happening. But it's like, that's what keeps the story going. You know, a story without conflict is a really boring story. I think Kurt Vonnegut famously said, make great characters and then make bad things happen to them.
One exercise that we do with our clients is we have them make a list of every possible conflict that could ever happen to their character, and then try to come up with 20 things. And then we say, okay, now come up with 10 more, and then come up with 10 more. And now put it all in your script. See how much conflict you can add to your script. And that's a really common beginner mistake, is that there's just simply not enough conflict happening in the story. And high stakes, lots of conflict, that's what drives a story. So something should happen on page 1.
Yeah, or the conflict is only of one nature. To me, that's the mistake of so many Hollywood studio films today, that the conflict is all external conflict, or
the world is ending.
The world is ending, yeah, so we need the superheroes to come in and stop the bad guy. But there's all kinds of different levels of conflict, between human beings. There's a psychological conflict between yourself, between you and the gods or the fates, and so the idea of the nature of the conflict in your script. If you only have external conflict coming at your character, one kind of like literally like everybody's throwing stones at them, then this is a boring movie. You need to have all different kinds of conflict.
It needs to be physical, emotional, spiritual, every type of
So
thing.
Story is not something without conflict. Story is about conflict, and the essential conflict in a story, by the way, is the conflict between what a character wants and what they need. So, the character says, I want to be an astronaut. They need to be somebody who can be dependent, interdependent with other people. So the movie ends, the story ends when those two things meet. When their want becomes their real need. So their want begins to transform. And it's not about being an astronaut that I should want. It's this thing. As soon as a character wants what they really should want, the story's over. But that kind of trying to get those two things to converge, what they want and what they need, that's the fundamental conflict of any movie.
And when a main character gets what they need, that's typically a happy ending. When the main character gets what they want, that's typically a tragedy.
The problem is there is no adversary, or there is no powerful adversary. Adversary is so critical. People need to work on their adversary until it is. The adversary should be the strongest person in the story. When I was coming up, you say, oh, they have to be equal. They have to be equal in power to the hero. No, they have to be much more powerful than the hero. It has to look, for most of the movie, it has to look like the hero has no bloody way of defeating this adversary or surmounting the problems being presented by this adversary. But they do it. They outthink them, and they outtry them and drive, and they can make it happen. And that's a story with great conflict, with a hero who is doing things, who sucks us in emotionally, that we can ride along happily for the journey. And that's how the good ones work.
What Roger Ebert used to call the idiot plot, where the thing is, if two characters just said what they know to each other, the movie would be over in 5 seconds.
Pretty much, okay,
And so basically what it is you have a character that is being forced by the writer, not by in real life. In real life they would say something, but if the writer realizes if they say it, the movie's over in 5 minutes, or now this thing goes in a different direction. So they don't say those things, they keep them to themselves, which plays false. Instead, what we want to do is we want to have and this is the thing. Often people, they're afraid to create the conflict because the conflict gets into the messy stuff. And so they hold back on the conflict when we need to get into that conflict. There's a thing that another screenwriting problem is delaying things, because that conflict really can't happen until this point in the movie when we're at this point. Well, what usually happens is they stall until they get to that conflict, when instead what they should do is have that conflict happen here and then have things just continue to get worse. So that scene here, instead of being the beginning of the conflict, instead is when the conflict's a hell of a lot worse. They don't escalate their conflict enough, and escalating conflict is important. Again, it's in dialogue, it would seem false if that character didn't say, there's a problem and here's what it is, or I have an issue with you. And they need to have that issue. It needs to start here, You know, the fuse needs to not just be lit, but then it needs to explode, and that explosion has to start a chain reaction of other explosions. So that's like an Act 2 problem often, is writers try to hold everything off until Act 2 when you need to kick off with, you know, with something exciting happening.
The first thing, before you even start writing the words of the scene, you want to step back and, as usual, my advice is ask questions. In other words, first of all, you should have already asked the questions: who is my hero? What is the hero's wound? What are they afraid of? What is their visible goal that they're going after? And where structurally does the scene occur? Because depending on how far along in that inner journey the character is, that's going to affect how they would react in the situation. After you've figured those things out, then the next question you want to ask is, what does my character want in this scene? And is that desire going to, or do they think it's going to move them closer to their goal, or at least overcome an obstacle to achieving their goal? If the answer to that question is no, then the scene should be jettisoned. It's not serving the story, because every scene has to move the character closer to their visible goal, or force them to face an obstacle or anticipate an obstacle that they didn't know they were going to previously. So let's say the answer is yes, though you do know that this is going to contribute to the goal, and you figure out what do they want to accomplish within the scene. Where do they want to be, or what do they want to have happen to the end of the scene? Then, what are they going to do to try and do that? That will constitute the action of the scene. The dialogue you just set aside until all these other things are figured out, because the dialogue is only really to reveal in some way how they're feeling about the situation, or it's dialogue where they're trying to persuade somebody to do something or get above somebody else, take control of a situation, and so on. But first you want to see, what does the character want in the scene, and then what is the obstacle they must face in the scene to achieving that? Because the emotion of a movie and the emotion of any scene is primarily going to grow out of the conflict. If it's not the conflict being faced right then, it's the conflict that they are anticipating, or occasionally that the audience is anticipating. In a thriller, we may know that the killer's in the next room and all the hero wants to do is get to the kitchen to make a sandwich, but it's still about what do they want and what are we anticipating is going to get in their way. And then when it comes to dialogue, especially if you struggle with dialogue, get something down. You should get anything down to begin with, just so you've got a scene to work with rather than a blank page. But if you don't know what the dialogue should be, write dialogue where the character is just saying how they feel and what they want. It's what's known as on-the-nose dialogue. It's terrible dialogue, but at least now you've got a scene. You've got action, you've got character, you've got dialogue, and now you can ask the last question that would be my suggestion, and that is, okay, now I know what they want. They're going through this action. How can I make it more difficult for them, first of all, but also, instead of having them announce their feelings or desires, can they do it without saying anything? Or if they, in a conversation, how can they hide their true desires or feelings and cover it up with more surface, superficial, subtextual language? And that's sort of what you're going for. And those are sort of the beats of going through it. Then it's a matter of just going through that process again and again and again with each successive draft. But that'll get you to something if you're looking at a blank page to begin with. So
it's good, Michael.
Oh, thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm going to write that down.
What I want a movie to be is constantly interesting. I was totally engaged by Imitation Game from beginning to end. They were able to comment on some very, very weighty and difficult issues without ever getting preachy or intellectual about it. Bullying, homophobia, issues involving war and peace and life and death. Should we tell these people that they're about to you know, that the Nazis are, with their U-boats, are about to sink this convoy? and we can save all the lives of the people in the convoy that way. But that will also tell the Nazis that we're onto their code, and they'll change the code, and we won't be able to read them anymore, and that'll cost more lives. These are very interesting questions, and they're asked in a dramatic context without ever becoming a lecture about principles or protocols or anything like that. Now, there's nothing wrong with lectures on principles and protocols, but the movie is not the place for that.
This is a danger of writing. This is getting back to that assumption thing we were talking about before, which we deal a lot with. I'm going to go back to Write Your Life. I'm telling you a story about a traumatic experience I had. Let's, for instance, say personal experience. And I'm going to assume that if I tell you everything that happened, you're going to have the same emotional reaction I did. That's a huge assumption. You may not. A writer can write a script. It may be true, it may be personal, it may be totally fiction. But the writer writing that script and all those characters is having an emotional experience as he or she is creating it. With these characters, how they're relating to each other, all the twists and turns in the story, and they're going, oh, that's great, assuming that anybody else reading it will be having the same reaction. That may not be true. So that the assumption of the writer is a problem, can be a problem. And the best way to deal with that is really simple. You tell the writer, there's your problem. You wrote that scene and you're very moved by it. I read the scene, I don't get it. Okay, what you're intending is great. I'm not getting it, and other people are not. You're assuming that we're getting it because you are so identified with those characters in that situation. Okay, not a problem. Let's figure out how we can make it clearer to the audience so the audience does get it. And that's my job as a director. That's my job as a directing consultant or a writing consultant, is to help writers get to that point where the scene is clearer. Now, one thing which we don't need to talk a lot about, but one thing is a script, speaking of script and writer, a script initially, in order to get made into a movie, has to engage the reader. And as you know, the reader very often is not the person who's going to produce it. The reader is somebody down the line in some production company, whatever it does. In other words, that script by itself, by its little self, those 120 pages, has to impact that reader. So the first thing is, let's make sure the reader gets it. The reader who just picks up another script and starts reading gets it. That's really crucial. So forget me, the director, and forget all the other people. We got to make sure that the script is strong enough that that works. And if it's not doing that, then it's not going to get made. And the writer can deal with his or her frustration, like, why can't they get it? Say, don't go there. Don't go, why can't they get it? Let's go back to how could, and this is what a lot of people like Michael Haig and Chris Vogler and all those people who teach screenwriting work with writers on. It's not, lots of times it's not about what the story is, it's about how do you craft these scenes and characters in a certain way that the writer will get it and eventually all the other people who are going to work on it. I'm just going to make this up. I had this bout with cancer and I fought off cancer. And it took, robbed me of a year of my life, but now I'm a cancer survivor. And I could tell you about it, and you should feel horrified by what happened, because I did, and frightened. And someone could tell me that, and I go, okay. It's not going to impact me the way you think it is, only because you, as you tell it, re-experience everything you went through. So that filter of assumption of a writer, even writing fiction, I created this great moment in the scene and nobody gets it. Well, then we have to keep working on it. I understand what you're going for. I understand what you want them to get. You haven't crafted it in a way for them to get it. So it's also understanding, not only from a writer's point of view, not only understanding their layer or barrier of assumption. And because every screenwriter, I think this is really true, finishes a screenplay, thinks it's brilliant. Hopefully they do. Otherwise, why do it? And that's an assumption too. But also, they have to realize that every reader has barriers against certain things that you have to plow through. You have to break through. You have to surprise them. You have to sort of find your way around the barriers and the obstacles that the reader has within themselves. So yes, you have to understand yourself, and you have to understand, you can't say, why don't you get that? You have to understand they don't get it for a reason.
When I teach, I am the home of TMI. I come in and vomit everything going on in my life, be it good, bad, tragic, happy. I am an open book. If I'm being completely honest, because it's free therapy and I have a captive audience of 20 people, but it's also because one of the great sages of all time and with a view of the human condition, Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin
Great reference.
said, I never want to be respectable, I always want to be responsible. Oh. And I love that quote. And I hope after the first class that people take with me, they know they're not going to get respectable at all. I will tell too much. And there is a little bit of method to my madness, though, because I know writers, directors who put themselves on that pedestal because they've had this degree of success and they feel that they have to come in and be very buttoned down and very above the people that they're talking to or talking down to. I don't look at it like that at all. I will tell you about my bad night, my hangover, my whatever. But part of it, again, it's like free therapy, but part of it is also, this is my life sometimes it's not terribly respectable, but I'm responsible because I will get my ass to my computer and write. And don't worry about being perfect. But that is that I wish I could say that my success rate was 100% with that. But again, most people will never finish their scripts because that sense of needing to be perfect. Oh, I'm being boring. Oh, this isn't working. It will take over and it will crush their creativity. And it's a very sad thing to witness. I try to get people over it. I try to say, look, it's a first draft. I try, don't worry so much. But that is the toughest job any person who's teaching any kind of creativity has, is to convince people to get out of their own way. And my way of doing it, again, is to say, today, students, I am a hot mess. But
those are the best classes.
But I wrote for 4 hours. I just don't, I've knocked wicker. I've made a living at this for 30 years. I mean, it's insane. Sometimes great, sometimes just skating by, sometimes whatever. But it hasn't come out of being perfect, believe me. But it's coming out of having enough discipline to write. Always don't need to be respectable, always be responsible.
Jimmy Page.
Jimmy Page.
Wow.
Thank you. Yeah.
I can go back to Sean Ryan again, the one who was so promising, and he got a job on a sitcom as soon as he came to LA, and then he didn't work for 6 years. And what he did is he wrote, and I think that he wrote about 14 spec scripts. And what happened is his scripts were all good, but nothing was getting him traction. And he asked his manager, he said to his manager, send me an example of a script that is getting somebody work. And his manager sent over the script that had the most buzz at the time, and Sean compared it page to page and said he'd have 3 things on a page that were really good, but this one, the one that got the buzz, every single beat was perfect. And when he realized that he had not been hitting the mark, he started to write and hit the mark. And in not too long of a time, he got hired on a show, and that show led to another show, and then he got, he developed The Shield. So you just have to keep working, you know. I suspect it was about 4 or 5 years in that happened. So he was only writing that next level of script for a couple of years. I don't know the exact dates, but I know that story.
And how do you test out a screenplay? You test it out by getting people to sit around a table, or at least half of them sitting around the table reading parts, and the other half of them sitting around the table drinking wine. That's important. Eating some cheese, and listen. And don't get actors together. Don't rehearse them. That would be the death of it. What you want is a SIC experience. Sic is the Latin word for as is. You just want to hear the script as is without trying to make it better. Because if something works on the page in the mouths of, you know, maybe just another writer, not a trained actor, you know it's alive. And if something's flat, then you know something's wrong. And then the hard task is to wake up from the coma that writers put themselves in when they hear their script being read out loud, and try to do what you need to do in order to fix it.
From beginning to end, the least we want is not to be bored. I mean, I go to the movies and see screeners. Scandalously, I'm going less and less to theaters and looking more and more at screeners. I used to feel guilty about not going to the theaters. Now I feel guilty about not screening the screeners. And the reason is usually I am bored. I think most art is pretty bad. Most paintings, most sculpture, most literature, most music is lousy. Now that also may seem like a cynical and a dark thing to say, but it's the opposite of that. The truth is that the stuff that is contemporary, much of it is going to be pretty bad. Some of it will be brilliant. What happens is that the bad stuff falls away. I was in New York not too terribly long ago, and I was in the museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of my favorite museums. And I didn't see a single painting there that wasn't timeless and eternal, that didn't deserve to be there. And you could get the impression from that the paintings are somehow worthy all the time. But what you don't realize, a lot of people don't realize, is that for every painting that hangs at the Met, there are 10,000 stupid, worthless, jerky, amateur paintings. Now, there's nothing wrong with, I think it's wonderful that people tried to paint and tried to be creative and took a shot at it. But it's unusual that it's worth bothering somebody else about. That is to say, there's something in the work that merits the attention and the consideration of the time of an audience, an observer. In film, because it is contemporary, even more so television, because it's in our face now, there hasn't been the chance for the bad stuff to drop away. So we think that it's uniquely bad when it isn't. It's just as bad as other art. Fortunately, the little bit of really, really good stuff is enough to change your life and make it worth engaging all of the stuff, so that you do see the good stuff. People say, why don't they make good movies now like they used to in the 30s and the 40s? Did they make good movies in the 30s and the 40s? They did. There were a lot of really good ones. But there were also a lot of lousy ones. We just don't remember them. I think 50, 60 years from now, they'll be saying, why don't they make good movies like they did back in the early, new millennium? Because people will have forgotten the Hunger Games. I'm not a big fan of the Hunger Games. I think people are going to forget about it. But they're going to remember The Imitation Game. We're into games today, I guess. The least we want, when I say don't be boring, I'm saying that's the very least that I want from a work of art. We're talking now about dramatic narratives. You know, I was at the Louvre in Paris and I saw the Mona Lisa, among others. How much time did I spend with it? A minute? If I'd spent 3 minutes with it, that would have been a long time. If I sat quietly now for just a few seconds, you'd feel how heavily time weighs. No, I'm just waiting for. See, if I get quiet even for 2 seconds, you get nervous and you jump in. I don't blame you. That's my point.
I see. Sorry. Okay.
No, not at all. That's you're helping me. But the most we want that's the least we want. I have a deal with my wife, which is if I start to nod out during a movie, she's supposed to let me do that, unless I'm snoring and wheezing and spraying everybody around us and bringing disgrace and discredit and humiliation upon us. It's up to the movie to keep me awake. And the fact of the matter is that I used to fight it. If I started to drift during a movie, I would fight it hey, sort of, I got a deep breath and try to, pay attention. Now if I start to drift, that's it. I'm going to nod out in this one. It's just not worth seeing, I've walked into movies where I was really weary, hadn't slept very well, but it was a good movie and it woke me up. So that's the least we want. Don't be boring. And if that's all you do, that's an incredible achievement. But again, that's the bottom. What's the top? And the top is I want my life changed completely the way great art does. I want it turned upside down and transmogrified. I want to be transported. And that's what Breaking Bad did to me. That's what The Sopranos did to me. My life is different, and, constantly because of my exposure to that great art. And that's what great art should do at the top end. It should just change your life forever.
How you know if you have blazing hot material? Your phone is ringing. People want to meet you. They want to take you out for lunch. They want to take you to dinner. They want you to come over to the barbecue. They want to buy your material or hire you to work on their projects. There's a buzz about you in town. If you don't have representation, agents and managers are sort of knocking on your door. Everybody's sort of kissing your butt and saying how fabulous you are, and you feel really fabulous. That's blazing hot material. When you get traction, that's how you know it's blazing hot. And there's people that aren't in LA, they're not in the business, and they feel like, I could write a fantastic script, let's say, and it'll never get into the right person's hands, and I'll never get discovered. If you have blazing hot material, that really will. And even if you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who can get your script to somebody, it's like 6 degrees of separation. If that material is blazing hot, you will be discovered, absolutely. And what happens is, if your material has been out in the marketplace for 3 or 4 months and nothing is happening, you can fool yourself by saying, you know what, they just don't get it, it didn't get to the right person. But the truth is, it's probably not ready yet. It's time to go back to the drawing board. And you wouldn't be the first person that had to happen for. That happens to most people, because you don't come out of the chute being perfect. I think that's a lot of people's misconceptions, especially screenwriters, is my first thing, it's going to sell, it's going to be great. Again, there's the Mickey Fisher phenomenon. Occasionally it happens, but that's really rare. That's really rare.
Writing a really kick-ass script and putting it in front of somebody and making the first page so good that they have to keep reading to page 5. And making the first 5 pages so good they have to keep reading to page 10. And making the first 10 pages so good that they never put it down until they get to the last page, and they have to pick up the phone and call you as soon as they're done. That's how good your script has to be. And it can't be that good that you can't think it's that good. All your friends have to read it and think, holy shit, this is the best thing I've ever read. Can I say that on your...
Yeah, please.
We're on the internet, right?
Yeah, please. We'll censor it for the ratings.
Okay. And And then your friends have to show it to their friends. And people who don't even know you have to read this and think, this is the best thing I've ever read. I can't wait to see this on television or in the movies. And when you have a script that's getting that kind of reaction from your friends, then you can walk into somebody's store and say, here, this is what I can do. Read this and you will hire me. And you'll have that confidence to go into the room and exude that. And if you have that confidence, people will read that first page. If you walk into somebody's office and you feel that way about your material, and you know without a shadow of a doubt that this is a great script, that gets across to people, and they'll read your first page. But if your first page is amateurishly written, they're going to stop right there.
I'm not afraid of being boring because I will jump off creative cliffs, and sometimes I'll land really hard and break my neck, and sometimes I'll land exactly where I need to land. But boring isn't an issue for me, and it's interesting because I've been at this a long time now, and I feel more unboring than ever. I feel creatively unleashed. Some of it is I have nothing to prove. I've got some cool posters and a couple of classics and all of that, but I'm not ever worried about boring. I am worried about good, and that's a different thing. And good, that it's going to resonate, and that people are going to feel it, and that's a different thing. Not boring, but being good. I worry about every day when I write, and I'm my harshest critic, and sometimes that gets in the way a little bit. I wish I could go to bed not analyzing and reanalyzing what I wrote that day, but maybe that goes with the territory. But yeah, I always want to, I want to be better than good. And I wasn't, you know, and again, it's sort of silly and maybe arrogant as it sounds, like when I was starting Beetlejuice with Michael, we're going to write a classic. I want everything I do to be great. And you don't always do that. I'm not even pretending that you always do that. But good isn't good enough ever for me, and boring doesn't enter into it.
Now let's just have some sexy, sensual fun. Sure, but you know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And you say, okay, now it's time to light the candles and pour the wine, and let's have fun. But you're not stuck in any particular place.